rifle, center target.
I want to continue with my short series on setting up a rifle for ELR. So extreme long range shooting. What the normal process, I've been through basically about the barrel and the action, and essentially getting the right style with the right twist and the right sort of barrel. The normal process that I'd start to talk about now would be going through the gun setup in the way of the stock. But in truth, when I honestly go through this process, the next thing that's important to me, which I'll then work the stock around and I'll make everything work around, or it's as important, is actually the scope and setting up the scope. So the actual choices on the scope are quite simple in the fashion of you want good to very good glass. You're going to be looking a long way. You want decent glass. So that means that largely, and I wouldn't say completely, but largely the $300 and $400 scopes are not up to the deal. I wouldn't say all of them, but largely they're going to that sort of price range. Hasn't got the glass quality in it. But that's only a small feature. Glass is important, but not as important as the two main things that I would call. One is it needs to be a tactical scope. It needs to be a style of scope that you can dial, so you can actually set a zero, set a 100-yard zero. I'll go through that later, but then be able to wind in your elevation to be able to make your shot. That's probably one of the most important features, is the amount of MOA you've got. For extreme range shooting, you really want to have like 80 would be an absolute minimum in the way of elevation. Most of the scopes that I'm selecting, and I tend to use the Night Force. I think Night Force is a decent scope, but I wouldn't call them the best scope. What I pick about them, what I like about them, is that on the likes of this scope, which is the Attacker, I have 120 minutes of elevation. And actually, when you set them up properly, which I'll go through a little bit, this one actually has 128 minutes of elevation. So that's something that really helps when you're getting out there into your subsonic ranges, into the extreme range side of things. The other feature that's important with the scope is that essentially that the tracking is very accurate. So with your dials, with your turrets, when you're actually winding it up and winding it down, you want that to be dead accurate. For obviously dialing onto your target, but you're going to wind a long way. You want to be able to go back to zero and still have zero. It's important to get on, but it's also important to record your data, because one of the most important things you're going to do is actually record your data and feed that back into your ballistic apps, so you end up really understanding your bullet, understanding what you really need to get on target each time. So accuracy of your turrets and range of your turrets. Now, as I said, I tend to use the Night Force. I'm not saying Night Force is the best scope. It's what's easy for me to get. I like the way they work. I like the way the turrets work. I like the way the scopes work. I tend to use MOA. That's another point I'll touch on. MOA is just how I think. I like the logic of 1 inch in 100 yards is 1 MOA, 10 inches at 1,000 yards is 1 MOA, 20 inches at 2,000 yards is 1 MOA. I think that way. It's easy for me to think that way. If I'd started in the military side of things, I'd started in the police side of things, I'd started where I was trained with mil radian, then I would probably think in mil radians. I don't. I think in MOA. That's why I use it. I would not say one's better than the other. I would say that the normal comments of your turrets being in the same as your reticle is important, but that's probably where I'd finish that conversation. So you want a decent quality glass. You want good elevation, as much as you can get. And then the other features are whether it's variable power or single power. Really, for extreme range shooting, I tend to recommend a variable power. There is places where you'll use it. It's nice to dial in at 100 yards and get more power when you're trying to get a perfect group. I also use it for, which I'll go through later on, I use a second focal plane scope to be able to dial back to give me extra holdover. Now, I'm not going to touch that conversation with this video. I'll do a separate video on first focal plane and second focal plane, because there is some issues one way and the other way. I'm not going to touch on that at the moment. I use second focal plane, but that may not be what suits you. I'll go through that, like I said, in another video. Okay, so we've touched on that, touched that. The other thing that I will touch on is essentially you're bolting your scope on. There is lots of videos out there, lots of information out there. It is the basic, simple information of get a decent base, make sure that it's set up with the right size screws for your caliber, little screws for smaller calibers, larger screws for larger calibers. Use a Loctite, it's a good idea so they don't come loose, with rails and rings, with lapping rings, all that sort of stuff. Listen, it's all relevant depending on what the setup is, and do it accordingly. Better quality stuff tends to need less work, and the likes of buying yourself a little torque wrench to be able to do up all your nuts and bolts on your scope. It's a good idea. They're not very expensive. It's a good idea. It saves you messing it up. It saves you leaving too loose and it coming loose, and it saves you tightening them up and it damaging the scope. It's a sensible move. What I do want to talk about, probably the main bit that I see wrong, the manufacturers aren't really doing the right thing as yet. A lot of old rifle builders, and I don't mean old guys, I mean guys that build rifles in an older fashion, a lot of gunsmiths, a lot of people haven't got caught up yet with what we're actually doing with these scopes. And this is what I'm about to explain, the nuts and bolts of how a scope works. I've got these diagrams up behind here. We start off with this diagram here. We have a basic representation of a barrel pointing straight ahead and a scope pointing straight ahead. And to the average person, that's all it works like. You look straight through that red line, which is where your target is, and the barrel's pointing at the same place, so it's all lined up and done. And in a core sense, yes, that's sort of right. But if we move along one, we'll see what we've actually got going on here. We've actually got, yes, the centre of the scope is still pointing straight ahead, but what we actually have is these two black lines are the range of our reticle. So essentially from all the way down to all the way up, we have a range in our reticle of where that actually moves. So that's the basic of the range of the reticle with you looking for the scope. Not to be confused with your field of view. Your field of view is larger than that, but your reticle, your centre point in your reticle, it can move, this is just a representation, but it can move both above the centre line and below the centre line. So let's go to the next one. This is the normal classic way of an old-fashioned scope setup, where essentially the scope is on, it's a standard rail, everything's dead straight. That red line is essentially straight ahead, and it isn't quite the case, but for this conversation's purposes, we'll say that red line is pointing at a 100-yard zero. Now, to understand the fact that when you want to shoot further than 100 yards, you need to raise your barrel up. So what that means, obviously, the barrel raises up. To do that, you have to point your scope down. Might sound a little bit confusing, but it's the way it works. Essentially, you raise your barrel by lowering your your actual crosshairs to make you shoot at the target. So if we come over back to this graph, back to this diagram, what I've highlighted here is essentially this scope. That's its maximum. It's the same drawing as before. That's its maximum position of the reticle. Now let's say it's a normal scope. It's an 80 MOA scope. It doesn't really matter. It could be an 80, 100, 120, a 200. Doesn't matter what it is. But let's say it's 80 for the moment. If you've got 0 is straight ahead, so 100 yards 0 is dead straight, then you can adjust it the other half. There's no point in taking the scope in the opposite direction. That's going to make you shoot closer than 100 yards. So all you've got is essentially from that 100 yard 0 to what you can adjust up to. It's actually pointing the reticle down, but that's actually up adjustment. So essentially, if you had an 80 MOA scope and you set it up in dead straight, what you approximately have in usable reticle adjustment or usable internal elevation is 40 MOA. Exactly half of what the scope is. And you can buy, like this scope here, a big 120 minute scope, or a scope with 120 minutes of elevation, and you're going to get half of that, 60 minutes of elevation. Now, most commonly in this sort of setup, people will run them on a 20, they'll have a 20-minute rail. Manufacturers, they provide 10 and 15 and 20. That's common. You'll see some more, but that's the most common. 20-minute rail that's on the actual rifle. Set up on even posts. What that'll give you is a little bit better. You're going to get essentially another 20 minutes. So if you look at a scope that was set up at 0 and it was an 80-minute scope, it's going to then give you, and you've got half of that, with those extra 20 minutes, you're going to get another 20. You're going to get 60 minutes. So it's better, but it's not great. You put it even a worse situation of a 120-minute scope and put it on where it had 60 minutes, and you put that 20-minute rail on, you just got to an 80-minute scope. So is it getting all your money out of your money for value? Are you getting what you want? No, you're not. So over here, what you do is essentially this red line now is set up, which is where your 0 is now the scope tilted forward to when the scope is at absolute 0, it's pointing at 100 yards. And then you'll find that you'll get the full maximum usage of that scope. And as you can see, we now have a full green line. So we can go right down, and as said, if you had an 80-minute scope with a half of that, which is 40 minutes, or a 40-minute rail, or a 40-minute base combination, I should say, but 40 minutes of cant on that scope will give you 80 minutes of usable elevation. You use your whole green band. If it's a 120-minute elevation scope, you need to put it on a 60 MOA base, and then you'll get your 120 minutes of elevation. So you get your full green band. So I hope that makes some sense. If we come back over to this scope, this rifle here, this is 120 minutes. And I've done it in it's a Hauer rifle, and it's a very simple system. Quite what I've used on most of my rifles, in truth, is I'm running a 40 MOA rail with a 20 MOA. This is the ultralight uni mount from, so it's actually the rings and the mount all have 20 minutes in them as well. So you've got 20 minutes in this, and you've got 40 minutes in that. That gives 60 minutes in the whole rifle, in the whole base. As I said, sometimes you'll get a bit extra. This now actually, well, it goes right down to 0. There's only a little tiny bit I could maybe get out of 0, but I can get right up to 128 minutes. So 0 at 100 yards, I have 128 minutes of elevation in the internal adjustment in this. Another thing I'll briefly go through with your different setups and with your scopes, with your rings and rail and that sort of stuff, a lot of people are still attached to trying to get their scope low and get it as close to the barrel as possible. I see a couple of negatives there. I see no positive, I should say. Unless you're shooting point blank shooting, so you're shooting in 20, 25, 50 yards where there can be trying to get that closer for that reason, or you're trying to fit into a gun case sort of stuff, which, okay, there's some positives there. It's not what these rifles are set up for. And well, in actual fact, the other fear that I've heard is essentially that by putting my scope up, I'm going to need to adjust more minutes, more elevation, because my scope's further away. That's not the case at all. I've forgotten the maths, I worked it out sometime or other, but you're up around the 3 or 4 inches before you're seeing any appreciable difference in that. So in actual fact, it works a little bit better. There's a little less, but not enough to actually talk about. The features that I like, so I want to have proper clearance. I want to make sure that I have the rail side of things in here with proper room, so that's all nice. But one of the features that I like building into them is I'd like to have the scope a little bit higher to make my head less tilted over onto the top of the stock, so there's a bit more natural position. Your neck isn't quite over so much as a little bit taller sort of shooting position. The main thing, that really is a personal preference thing, and people can have what they like. The main thing I'd like to point out is that some extra height in your scope is not a negative, and in most cases it's actually a positive to get that scope up off the rifle a little bit. So listen, I hope that makes some sense. It's a very important feature of ELR shooting. So anyway, that'll do for this one. Thank you for checking us out. I hope that helps, and we're back soon with some information about first focal plane versus second focal plane. Thanks for watching the video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Down below here we've got a link to our web store where we have some of the specialised long-range shooting products that we actually produce. Check them out.
And for those of you who can, it'd be great to get some help. In our store we have support bits, and when you purchase those, the money goes direct to our channel and helps us bring these videos to you.
Thanks, guys.
See you next time.